My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. You may notice I'm wearing my Own the East t-shirt here. There's a reason why we're doing that, and I'll explain that coming up throughout our show here today. You may see a lot of this over the course of the next few days. In other words, it's going to be a really fun show. I think we got, in a roundabout way, some good news from the SEC yesterday. We'll have to kind of sift through it and see what it all means. It is at the very least interesting news, and I would say more good than bad. I loved something that LSU coach Ed Orgeron has said this week. You'll hear that on today's show. Our buddy Connor Riley going to join us for more on the plan for college football to return this fall, and also some of the stuff going on with Georgia in the wake of JT Daniels getting granted immediate eligibility. We will look at one of Georgia's most important games this upcoming season in great detail on today's show as well, and we are glad to have all of you with us for all of it. As DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So last night I was watching the NASCAR All-Star race. It was taking place at Bristol Motor Speedway, and there were, I guess, maybe in the neighborhood of about 15,000 fans there. I'm not sure exactly how many it was, but I think about 15,000 fans. And you kind of forget, right? We've been without sports so long, and now in the way in which sports is trying to come back, it's coming back without really fans anywhere. You forget what it feels like to have fans in the stands. And listen, admittedly, for the average NASCAR race, the cars are so loud you can't really hear the fans during the race, but Chase Elliott won. Huge UGA fan, by the way. Elliott wins the race, and when he gets out of the car at the end, you hear these cheers. Now, it's not 100,000 people cheering the way that you get in an SEC football game. It's 15,000 people in a stadium fit for 160,000. So it's a little bit different kind of crowd reaction, much smaller crowd than the typical college football fan is used to. But that noise, that unmistakable noise of happy fans in attendance at a sporting event, when you get a little bit of a taste of it, I don't know. For me last night, I realized just how much I've missed it and just how much I'm hoping for more of it. So with that in mind, let me begin the show this way today with an idea of possibly what Georgia's schedule could look like for this upcoming season. Now, first of all, there was a very hopeful tone struck by a recent Sports Illustrated story that looked at, and this came out yesterday, Pat Forty and Ross Dellinger, the writers on this, closed-door meeting from the SEC athletic directors going back to Monday. A lot of folks talking about what went on there, and the general consensus that Forty and Dellinger got in the piece they wrote at Sports Illustrated, and I'll make sure I put a link to this when I post the show later on today, the world-famous DawgNation.com, is that through all the muck and the mire of how things might play out, the general consensus in the room is that the folks there, the athletic directors present, are strongly in favor of playing college football this fall. And to follow up on that, and this was fascinating reporting by both Dellinger and Forty, very interesting stuff. To follow up on that, 3 different schedule options seem to be more popular than everything else. Now, I'll give you these 3, and I'll sort of give you the ones that don't seem to have much of a discussion right now. So according to what Sports Illustrated says in the report yesterday, that the 3 options the SEC is looking at in the most detail right now is an 8-game conference-only schedule, where you essentially play the conference games that you were already scheduled to play, or a 9-game schedule that includes 1 non-conference game. Once again, 8 conference games plus 1 9-conference games. This has been kind of called a +1 model by some folks within the world of college athletics. Or the other option would be a 10-game schedule. Once again, 8 conference games plus 2 non-conference games. That's what's being talked about by the SEC right now. Now, there are a couple of options that, according to Sports Illustrated, that you don't see much popularity for at the moment. The first of these is the full 12-game schedule, the way that it's currently scheduled. No current SEC team is supposed to be playing a Big Ten team. A couple of SEC teams were slated to play Pac-12 teams. But at least on the basis of the Sports Illustrated report, you don't seem to hear a lot of talk right now about the idea of somehow playing a 12-game schedule. Doesn't mean that it's dead. Doesn't mean that's impossible. but the options that were the most likely were the ones that are mentioned there. The other thing that you don't see, at least according to the reporting from Sports Illustrated, a whole lot of love for within the room on Monday when the SEC athletic directors kind of got together and met in person, you don't see a lot of love for more than 8 SEC games. For instance, one of the options that had been kind of kicked around on message boards and sort of talked about on the internet was the idea of, well, maybe it's just SEC opponents playing each other this year. There has been, obviously, the Big Ten, the Pac-12 have already made the decision to do that. But the SEC athletic directors do not want 9 conference games, or even, as some of us have even speculated, what if there's 10 SEC games? One athletic director, as quoted by Sports Illustrated, said that concept was laughable. The SEC folks think playing more SEC games than you need to is just too difficult to really take seriously. That's not something that they want to do. So once again, to kind of recap this, 8 games only playing SEC opponents, or 8 SEC opponents plus 1 non-conference game, or 8 SEC opponents plus 2 non-conference games. Those are the options that, according to Sports Illustrated, the SEC is considering the most right now based on the closed-door meeting that went on Monday. Now, we can add to that this. Gary Stokan, who is the CEO of Chick-fil-A Bowl Incorporated, or I should say Peach Bowl Incorporated. They run the Peach Bowl at the end of the year. They run the Chick-fil-A kickoff games at the beginning of the year. He was also quoted at 24/7 Sports here this week on the idea of one of the ways in which they're trying to work with the 3 leagues thus far that have said that they are, or haven't yet said they're canceling non-conference games. That's the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12. The way in which they're trying to work on all of this with them, because as it currently stands, you've got Florida State that's supposed to play West Virginia, you've got Georgia that's supposed to play Virginia, and you've got Auburn that's supposed to play North Carolina. So Gary Stokan was quoted by the West Virginia 24/7 Sports side, and this is Stokan saying that what we've suggested is if they play conference games only plus 1 game, and by they he means these other leagues, because we know the ACC and the SEC like to play their rivalry games, if they went in that direction, then we could provide an alternative. We've said we'll match up West Virginia versus Virginia on Monday night on ESPN on Labor Day, and then the next week we'll play the North Carolina-Auburn game that's scheduled. So if you're following what Gary Stokan says there, and this is all just saying we would do this, not that this is going to necessarily happen, but what Stokan is saying, if you go the 8 conference games plus the 1 non-conference game, then the Georgia-Virginia game would just be simply lost on that. Now, Georgia's not going to back down off that contract, necessarily without looking at all of its options, because as we said on Friday's show, Georgia is slated to be paid a lot of money for being a part of that game. If there are no fans in the stands, you can make the case there's no money to pay Georgia with, so the contract might not be worth the paper that it's printed on. But clearly right now, Georgia, because it's on the receiving end of those dollars based on the current contract, it's going to want to know what all of its options are. But it just could very well be the game just fizzles out because there's no way to pay the teams for being there if the fans aren't in the stands. I'll let the business folks figure all of that out. But you certainly get to see a sense from what Stokan says here, the Peach Bowl CEO, of the way in which the SEC might be able to kind of navigate all of this. You've already got Georgia that plays Georgia Tech every year. You've got Florida that plays Florida State every year. South Carolina that plays Clemson every year. Kentucky that plays Louisville every year. That's a perfect non-conference opponent for each of those teams. As it just so happens to be true, as Stokan says there, you've got Auburn scheduled to play North Carolina this year. You've got Tennessee scheduled to play Oklahoma this year. You've got Ole Miss scheduled to play TCU this year. I think you've got Arkansas scheduled to play Notre Dame. You've got Mississippi State, I believe it's BYU they're scheduled to play. You, for the most part, got everybody who's got that one Power 5 opponent non-conference game. Now, with the exception of, I guess, Texas A&M has lost Colorado and Alabama has lost USC, you'd have to find something for them. But pretty much everybody else kind of has a non-conference dance partner. So if you want to speculate out loud for a moment, it's easy to see the way in which the SEC could get to a 9-game conference schedule if they're willing to push for it, play the 8 conference games. You've got kind of a perfect dance partner for like 12 of the 14 teams, I would say, in terms of a non-conference opponent. You got to do something with Alabama. You got to do something with Texas A&M. Now, there's a potential monkey wrench in all of this. Let me move on and talk about that now, because if you go back and listen to the few things I've been saying over the last few days, there was one thing that I have said recently that was probably wrong, and one thing that I've said over the last few days that I think has turned out to be really, really right. So let me deal with that right now. You ever watch the Colin Cowherd show every Monday he does the where Colin was right and the where Colin was wrong. Well, here's my own version of like sort of where BA was wrong and where BA was right. If you want to go back to me on Friday's show, the one thing that I said was, if there are leaks that come out of this meeting, then it's probably bad news because it's almost like they're trying to get out in front of a bad story. I think there were a ton of leaks on the basis of the Sports Illustrated story that I just quoted you from, and yet ultimately the presence of those leaks would seem to be more good than bad, I would say. It's not perfect news. There's a little bit of lack of, hey, we're willing to do whatever we have to do to get on the football field. It seems to be a little bit lacking in that regard, but for the most part, I would say it's more good news than not in terms of how all this is playing out. So count me wrong on that. I told you on Friday I thought if leaks came out of the Monday meeting, it might not be good. There were a ton of leaks, and I would say for the most part, those leaks suggest more good news than not, at least in terms of the strong desire to get football back on the field this fall. However, here's the one thing I'll leave you with. This is the area in which, and we called this on the spot on Friday, and it could not have been proven more true. We said with the Big Ten's decision to cancel its non-conference games that this was obviously about money. This was not about panic because they know the season's not going to take place. On the basis of the reporting of the Detroit Free Press and other outlets, the Big Ten seemingly had a contractual out to get out of its games against MAC opponents, to get out of its games against the sort of group of five or FCS level opponents. The Big Ten seemingly is pretty confident in its ability to break those contracts. If you read the story at sportsillustrated.com, the SEC is not quite as confident in its own ability to break the contracts it has with MAC opponents, more like Sun Belt opponents and FCS level opponents. It may not be quite so confident in that. So all of this, the potential complication for how many games the SEC wants to play, kind of is determined by, can you get out of the games against lesser non-Power 5 competition without having to pay them like the $1 million plus that you probably owe them? We said on Friday that all of this non-conference talk was really about that more than anything else, and the reporting from Sports Illustrated from this week, I think, validates that point pretty well. So a lot of moving parts on all of this, and we'll do our part to continue to cover this here on DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. I'm Brandon Adams. Good to have you with us. A lot of action behind the scenes today, as sometimes goes down when you have as many platforms we try to do the show on. So we appreciate all of you being with us and appreciate all the folks that are helping us here today get this thing on the air. And just good to have you with us. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them. As I said, I'll post the show later on today at the world-famous DawgNation.com. It's just really, really great to have you here today. Big thanks to Merriweather and Tharp for making it all possible. Your source for Georgia divorce. If you find yourself on the verge of facing a divorce situation, here's the one thing I know. You've got questions. Well, Merriweather and Tharp can provide those answers. And in many cases, they can provide those answers with free resource. If you go to theatlantadivorceteam.com, that's the website, theatlantadivorceteam.com, check out some of the blog posts, check out some of the podcasts. Find that way to get that initial consultation and then make the decision. Maybe one of the most important decisions you can make of putting Merriweather and Tharp to work for you. They've handled these cases thousands of times. They know exactly how to navigate what may be a tricky scenario for you, for them less so because of the institutional knowledge they've gained. As I said before, your questions, they have answers to them. You can seek that from our friends at Merriweather and Tharp. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. All right, let me just quickly say this from a housekeeping standpoint. So if you're watching a video, I have my Own the East t-shirt on today. We are going to embark today on a little bit of an Own the East season preview. This will be the, fourth year in a row we've done Own the East, which is always kind of really fun to think about. This is the first time, though, that we've done the Own the East preview series as a part of DawgNation Daily presented by Merriweather and Tharp. So I'm really excited about doing that. We're going to begin today with looking at the Florida Gators. We'll do that a little bit later on in the show. Then next week I'm going to be on vacation. Now this is a little bit new for us, so I want to just kind of give you a heads up on this, then we'll move on and do the rest of the show here. So we will have podcast and video every day next week. We are going to take a break on the radio for a week, but we'll be back the following week there on that. But if you check out however you can normally connect with the show, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, maybe not Twitter, but Facebook and YouTube, certainly podcast as well. Check out the show next week. It'll be pre-recorded episodes, not live. We won't try to pull the wool over your eyes on that. Pre-recorded episodes letting you know about the upcoming season, what we like about Georgia, how Georgia matches up against some of its top rivals. It's our Own the East season preview. This is the fourth straight year we've done it as Georgia tries to win the East now for a fourth consecutive year. That's a real historic accomplishment in and of itself. So we'll do a lot of that on the show today, on the show over the course of the next few days. Live here on this Thursday, live again on Friday, and then pre-recorded all next week. A little shorter version of the show, but some really good stuff with John Stinchcomb. Jeff Sintel is going to be a part of it. Very busy in all of that heading towards next week. I'll tell you more about that tomorrow as well. But I just want to make you aware of that we will have shows next week that will be pre-recorded. They'll be a little bit shorter, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun nonetheless. All right, I'm going to have Connor Riley here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Let me do one thing before we get there with Connor. And let me say it like this. So we just talked about all of the logistic stuff potentially facing college football as it tries to get back going here again this fall. I think it's good news the SEC is seemingly steadfast in trying to get that done, seemingly steadfast in trying to find a way for that to happen. And the one thing I've been saying on the show for a while is, at some point in time, someone's going to have to sort of step up and say, college football matters. Because the powers that be, or those that consider themselves the powers that be, they're never going to give college football permission to exist. They're never going to give college football permission to do this. Thumbs up, it's okay, you guys can move forward. But if colleges themselves are moving forward, if professional sports is moving forward, then there's really, in my mind, no reason why college football should not be doing the same thing, because of the value that I think college football provides the players who play it, to the societies who build themselves around it. I think college football matters. And I was really happy in that regard, with that in mind, to hear something that LSU coach Ed Orgeron has said recently. He's been making the rounds a bit. I want to give you a little bit of an audio taste of him from an appearance on Fox News. I thought the LSU coach here struck a very, very nice tone with his words. Let me let you hear Coach O for a moment.
Yeah, I think we definitely need football. I think we're going to have football. There's obviously going to be some adjustments. Obviously, the safety of our young men are going to be first, but we're ready. Our guys came back early. We spent a week on educating on COVID-19, what to do, especially wearing a mask, social distancing. We have not had one breakout of a virus in our workouts. Our guys have done a tremendous job. We feel that we're capable and ready to handle this and ready to play football.
So I think that's great from Ed Orgeron for a couple of reasons. First of all, there were some additional comments from a different appearance where he talked about football being kind of the lifeblood of America. I think that's true in some ways. And listen, there are a lot of people who don't think that's true. Coincidentally, there are also some of the people who think it's not safe to play college football this year. I'll let you make some determinations on that for yourself. But I think that Orgeron was right to say what he said by discussing how important football is, by saying that we do need it. I think the institution of football, I think, it improves the lives of the players who play it. I think it unites the communities who support it. I think from that standpoint, it is, in my mind, an essential business. I also like the idea that Orgeron says we're ready. This is very similar to what Michigan coach Jim Harbaugh said recently, too. It's not irresponsible to play football. It's a volunteer. It's volunteering for responsibility, saying, hey, we're going to take care of our players. We believe, this is Orgeron talking, I can't validate if what he's saying is true or not, but I think it's brave of him and bold of him to say it. We believe that we can take better care of our players on campus than they can be taken care of back in their hometowns. If that's what Orgeron thinks, I think it's a good thing that he steps up and say that. I can't tell you if that's true or not, but it's not irresponsible for Orgeron to say it that way. This is him saying, I want the responsibility of taking care of my players. So I think it's kind of interesting just how much I've grown to like Ed Orgeron over the last couple of years. The kind of way in which, I'm not an LSU fan, you guys know that, but I think that Orgeron typically speaks with a purpose, and I think that he speaks with a lot of energy. This is not, some mascot. This is not, some silly guy. This is a guy that I think takes his role as a caretaker of football pretty seriously. And I got to tell you, as someone who believes that college football needs to be back this fall, it was nice to hear someone in the corridors of power associated with the sport step up and kind of say the same thing. So good stuff from Ed Orgeron, at least in my mind. It's DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. A 5-star recruit for the class of 2021 has put Georgia in his list of finalists. We'll talk about that later on in the program. As I said before, we'll start our Own the East season preview series today with a look at the Florida Gators and what it's going to take for Georgia to beat them again, win the East for a fourth consecutive year. That's all still to come on our show today. But for now, on what's out there in terms of college football getting back and the latest in the Georgia quarterback situation after JT Daniels was given eligibility, let's talk to Connor Riley right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So fun to get a chance to talk to Connor Riley. We'll cover a lot of ground with him over the course of the next couple of minutes. Connor doing double duty, producing us today, also appearing as a guest, and behind the scenes taking care of a lot of business too, which is a really nice thing to be able to do. Connor, I don't know how much of the first part of the show you got to hear, but we tried to cover the news that's out there. Sports Illustrated reporting that the SEC very much wants to have a season this year, looking at some possibilities, seemingly not a 12-game schedule, seemingly not more than 8 conference games, but some version of 8 games, 8 plus a non-conference, 8 plus 2 non-conferences, trying to find a way not to play groups of 5 and FCS opponents, trying to find a way not to pay those teams for the game that won't be played. I would say this is a lot to digest, but it certainly seems to me more good news than not.
Yeah, I was not exactly able to listen to your opening monologue. There were a lot of technical behind-the-scenes issues, but to my knowledge, we have everything up and running well. And fortunately, BA, being the professional that he is, sent me the article last night, and I had a pretty good feeling that was what he was going to be talking about today. So I read that cover to cover. We exchanged some funny, maybe not totally safe for air text about some of the jokes or funnier points of the article, but yeah, I think it's an encouraging sign that I know you had said what you had said about any possible leaks. With Ross Dellinger is an incredible reporter and a very well plugged in person within the SEC, so I'm not surprised that his name is on this. And I do think it is a positive sign that they have openly discussed possibilities of what the season might look like, and I think more importantly, if you're a Georgia fan, what it might look like to try and get that Georgia Tech game in there, because both sides have said that this is something that they want to see happen.
And for me, it's not so much, I really want Georgia to play Georgia Tech. I just want Georgia to play more than 8 games.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, so if Tech's the 9th game, then fine. I'm not one of these guys that sort of lives and dies with clean old-fashioned hate. I don't care that much about it really one way or another. But I'd rather have 9 games than 8. Mm-hmm. I don't think the 10 seems all that likely. But what Gary Stokan told 24/7 Sports matters to me. The fact that for the most part, and maybe I'm leaving somebody out, but just about every SEC team other than Alabama and Texas A&M already has a game that could be that 9th game. When I read what Sports Illustrated writes, as you said, Dellinger and 40, when I think about all the other circumstantial evidence that's out there, boy, it seems like that it's very easy to draw a pathway for how the SEC lands on a 9-game schedule. That's just me speculating, but that's kind of what we do for a living anyway.
Right, and I think you can probably find either, if you're right now Texas A&M and Alabama, which are the only 2 teams that have had a non-conference game impact. Let's say you want to go to a 9-game conference schedule, which I think makes things a little bit easier for the Big 12 since they already are a 9-game schedule. There's a possibility that's what the Pac-12 decides to do and the Big 10 just decides to do. So you can pretty easily just find one other Power 5 team for both Alabama and A&M to theoretically satisfy the 8-game conference schedule.
And by the way, it could be Notre Dame for both.
It could be, yeah.
Or BYU, there's no shortage of opportunities, assuming that the Big 12, the ACC both play. You don't have a shortage of opportunities for who you could select in that scenario.
All right. I mean, Notre Dame might not be thrilled about the possibility of that, but I believe they're already playing. They're playing 6 ACC teams already. Yeah. So theoretically, if you want to get to 9 total games, if you're Notre Dame, you simply tack on Alabama, A&M, BYU. You add in the 6 ACC games they already have on their schedule. There's your 9 games,
right.
And I think that would potentially solve a lot of issues. Now, Notre Dame's not going to be thrilled about having to play Alabama and A&M,
right?
But no one would be. So.
And they may not have a lot of other options.
Exactly. That's the other thing,
and
too.
I feel like I got to say this for the 9,000th time. This is all just speculation. Yeah. It's just thinking out loud. But if you want to find an opponent for A&M and Alabama so you can play a 9th game, I think it just wouldn't be that hard to do that if that's what you want to do.
One of the things that when all this news was happening last week that I was personally kind of fascinated with was there was a lot of hand-wringing or worrying or people shouting about Notre Dame. And I was just very interested in why people were so just adamant about, well, this is what Notre Dame gets for not joining a conference, or this is why Notre Dame should join a conference.
Right.
And, ultimately Notre Dame, if other teams are playing football, which, based off this, what the commissioner said, they're going to try and do, which I do think is a positive thing and perhaps something that needs to be heard after everything that was sort of been put out there in the general feel. Myself, we've talked off air about this. Last week I did not feel that there would be a college football season. Admittedly, this week, after reading what Dellinger and 40 reported, I do feel probably a little bit more optimistic than I did a week ago.
We're not going to talk about this the whole time, but I do want to follow up on that. The one thing I feel completely validated on is, I feel like I called this on Friday, that the Big Ten canceling its 9 conference games was about money more so than concern about the virus. It seems pretty clear that they're what you call bye games, the lesser opponents. It seems pretty clear they felt like they had the power to break those contracts on the basis of the Sports Illustrated report. you don't necessarily get the sense the SEC teams are quite as confident in their ability to break those contracts, especially if they were to try to play 10 total games, 2 non-conference. I think Georgia would be in favor of that because right now Georgia's the only SEC team that has, two Power 5 level non-conference games scheduled. Georgia may want a 10-game conference schedule. I think the SEC will probably try to avoid that because I think they want a justification for not paying teams like Louisiana Monroe for games that won't be played.
Have you seen the movie The Big Short?
I do know the movie.
So you know the scene where Ryan Gosling, he's getting ready to explain to Steve Carell and the investors, essentially why the housing crisis is going to collapse. And he's got this Jenga stack in front of him, and he asks rhetorically in the room, "What's that smell?" And his assistant says, "Opportunity." And he's really confident he's right. And Ryan Gosling's like, "No, you idiot. Money. and to your larger point, the Big Ten moving to a conference-only schedule, I don't think that was necessarily about opportunity or a chance to say, hey, we're worried about this. We're going to condense this. As you pointed out, it was about money. And at the end of the day, that's what all this, rightly or wrongly, everything always comes back down to money.
Plus, they could have very well known that the Pac-12 was going to cancel its games anyway, which would have lost you Michigan, Washington, would have lost you Ohio State, Oregon. But those were road games for SEC for the Big Ten teams anyway. Yeah. So not as much of a of a loss necessarily. Let me move on. You got some interesting things to say lately, and you and I talked about this a little bit when the JT Daniels news first came out that he got immediate eligibility. I am very willing, and listen, I'm as much of a, I guess you would call it Georgia homer. I'm as much of a Georgia homer as you can be. I love UGA, and don't make any bones about that. Yet I am absolutely willing to say that Georgia, specifically speaking, Kirby Smart, mishandled Georgia's 2018 quarterback situation. I think they misevaluated Justin Fields. I think that Fields was better than Georgia gave him credit for, maybe better than Smart himself gave him credit for. The ways in which they used Fields during that season was totally nonsensical. I am very willing to say all of that. However, the one thing I'm not going to say is because Georgia loused it up in 2018, it's somehow destined to do the same thing in 2020 with what also seems like two potentially capable quarterbacks in Daniels and Newman. I don't think the one thing necessarily means the other here. There's a way to learn from your mistakes. That's something you've talked a lot about on the DawgNation platforms this week.
Yeah, I've been open and willing to admit that, I got it wrong on the Justin Fields, Jake Fromm thing. Jake Fromm scenario. I was pretty adamant that, playing Jake was the right move in 2018, and now in 2020, you can say benefit of hindsight or whatnot. That was pretty clearly the wrong move. They should have gone with Fields. Fields was the better college quarterback last year, and I think overall he's the better college quarterback. But, and I wrote this on Tuesday, very rarely in life, though, you make a mistake in some scenario, and then, shortly thereafter, you find yourself almost in a very, very similar position with a chance to show what you've learned and sort of grow and move on from that mistake and sort of change the way people talk about you because of that mistake. That is essentially what Kirby Smart has found himself in here now that JT Daniels is eligible. He's got 2 quarterbacks that have started over 10-plus Power 5 games at the Power 5 level, which I think is a significant thing, especially in a season where, a player could test positive for COVID on a Friday and not end up playing that Saturday. So having 2 quarterbacks of that caliber is going to be, I think, a very big benefit for Georgia. I think the really interesting thing now is what type of offense does Todd Monken and Kirby Smart, to a degree, want to run? Because JT Daniels fits one version of that, and Jamie Newman, I think, fits a somewhat different version of that. And, what we know about Monken and his offenses in the past, he's going to try and get the most out of the guys he's got. His quarterbacks in Tampa Bay when he was a play caller were Ryan Fitzpatrick and Jameis Winston. Those guys aren't fleet of foot, and so that's probably why Monken wasn't running those guys around a whole lot, but he was able to get quite a bit of production out of both Winston and Fitzpatrick. Not a 30 interception season like Bruce Arians did this year with Jameis Winston, but a solid season from those guys nonetheless. So I'm going to be really interested now to see where they go with the starting quarterback. What does that say about what Georgia wants from its offense? How much of that is Monken related, and how much of that is Kirby Smart ultimately having the final decision power when it comes to that?
Yeah, here's the one thing I'll say. Sometimes you may envy people who don't care what anybody thinks. I think not caring what anyone thinks is an okay strategy as long as you're sure you'll never need anything from anyone. I don't know that college football coaches necessarily have the freedom to not care what anybody thinks. What I'm building towards is this. If Georgia were to not play Jamie Newman as a graduate transfer who seemingly had a lot of options, chose Georgia pretty early in his process, which meant that somehow Georgia had to do some convincing this was the right place for him. If they don't play him, in other words, not give him a chance to show what he's about on the field in front of all of us to see, then I do think there could be some blowback on the recruiting trail for Georgia about that. Now, you can say, well, Georgia can't worry about that. They just got to have the best possible team they can have. Well, as long as Georgia goes out there and succeeds, all is great. But if you have a graduate transfer and you don't use him, good luck trying to get a graduate transfer quarterback ever again. Now, how much does that matter? People can decide for themselves. I would say that it probably matters some that Georgia has a responsibility to do right by Jamie Newman in a way that exceeds its current responsibility to JT Daniels because Newman's only got the 1 year of eligibility left.
Or graduate transfers or transfers in general because, while Georgia hasn't exactly gone to the Florida route of, hey, we're going to take guys who might have to sit out a year, but we're going to bring them in and add talent to our roster in that manner. Georgia pretty consistently has brought in guys who have been eligible right away. I believe J.R. Reed is the only transfer that has had to sit out since coming to Georgia. So you look at guys, like a Lawrence Cager, the impact he had last year, even a guy like Eli Wolf, the impact he had. If things don't go well or don't work out with Newman here, you absolutely can guarantee that that opposing teams are going to use that when trying to pursue graduate transfer options. And this is something that is going to, if things don't work out with Newman, follow Georgia around. And I would also point out that with what happened with Fields, and if they don't pick Newman and things don't go well with JT Daniels as the starting quarterback, and when I say go well at Georgia, that means winning the SEC.
Yeah,
you're going to have a lot of people wondering, well, why is Georgia? Kirby Smart clearly doesn't want dual threat quarterbacks. He doesn't want athletic quarterbacks because JT Daniels, well, he's a capable athlete. He's a guy who was not known for running around beforehand, and he's coming off an ACL injury. I think that, to your point about transfers, is also going to potentially follow it around at the quarterback recruiting level going forward as well.
And if you play Newman in some games, he doesn't play well, you've got no responsibility to keep playing him after that. But where 2018 kind of comes back to haunt you a little bit is if you say, hey, we're seeing these two guys at practice, we think that JT Daniels is the better between the two, there is going to be some skepticism about that opinion because the last time we were told that one guy was clearly better than the other, once we got enough information, I think most of us decided, I'm not really quite so sure that's true.
Yeah, and that goes back, again, it all goes back to the Fields thing. That's one of the more consequential decisions that Kirby Smart has made in his time as Georgia's head coach. And ultimately, I think until he wins a national title or gets stellar quarterback play, it's something you've seen guys like Alabama's Nick Saban, Dabo Swinney at Clemson, until you sort of see that level of quarterback play at Georgia, I think that label and that decision specifically with Fields is going to continue to follow Kirby Smart.
I sort of get the impression that DeJuan Mathis may be the 2020 version of what Stetson Bennett was in 2017. Remember, there were Georgia players in the 2017 roster. This is a team that won the SEC and played for the national championship. There were people on that team calling Stetson Bennett the GOAT, like the greatest of all time. So, Bennett had some huge, huge fans amongst Georgia players. We've already seen some pretty complimentary tweets from, Malik Herring and Eric Stokes about DeJuan Mathis. I think that clearly Mathis is going to have some fans among Georgia players. I am going to stick beside my opinion, though, that ultimately the quarterback that plays the most for Georgia this year is going to be one of the guys that has the most experience, and I would say that the second most played Georgia quarterback this year will be another of the guys that has experience. As I said on yesterday's show, I like Mathis. I like Beck. I like what they bring to the table. I love that Georgia players seemingly like Mathis as much as at least we've heard from a couple of them this week. This quarterbacking job, though, I still think is going to belong to either Newman or Daniels.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about how Kirby Smart, when he has the opportunity to bring in more talent, he will not hesitate to do that. And he's done that with Newman, and he's done that with Daniels. But I also think if Kirby Smart was truly, truly, truly 100% confident that either DeJuan Mathis, Carson Beck, and Stetson Bennett as well were the guy for the Georgia football program going forward, I don't think they would have brought in JT Daniels. I understand Newman is a one-year stopgap. You didn't know what Mathis is at the time in January, what his sort of health status was going to be going forward. But, bringing in Daniels, I think maybe, publicly anyway, shows that I am worried not just about the quarterback position for this season, but going as forward as well, because Newman does only have one season, and in a world where they don't bring in JT Daniels, they very likely have 0 combined starts at the college level on that 2020-21 roster when Georgia opens up against Clemson and Charlotte.
You wrote about the Georgia offensive line. I want to finish by talking about that. So here's the point I've been making for the most of the offseason, that I feel good about what Jamari Salyer is going to likely provide at left tackle, where I think he's going to start. Even if that's below the sort of all-SEC caliber, I think it's plenty fine. Left guard, if I assume that's Justin Schaefer, just for the sake of conversation. I think Schaefer was probably pretty good last year, but there were just 2 really good subs ahead of him. on the Georgia offensive line. I think that Schaefer's probably good enough to play. I don't think you got much of a problem there. I think that Trey Hill's probably a better player than some people give him credit for. I think you're fine at center. Right guard, once again, I think Ben Cleveland's probably a little bit better than some people sometimes give him credit for. I think you're probably fine there. Now, I haven't said great anywhere yet. I've said fine across the board. I guess my point is, if I've got capable getting the job done at 4 spots, the big unanswered question at right tackle, I'm sort of okay with that. I don't need this offensive line to win the Joe Moore Award for Georgia to win the national championship. It'd be great to have a great offensive line. I think you've just got to be good. And there's a chance it's not good, right? I mean, there's unanswered questions potentially about a number of the names I just mentioned, and certainly a huge, huge unanswered question at right tackle. But if I can get good from the 4 spots and be okay at the 5th spot, I'll go to battle against anybody with that.
Yeah, you look back at that 2017 Georgia team, it was a very good offensive line.
It was not a great offensive
line. But it was
no.
not, to that point, while yes, it had Isaiah Wynn and Andrew Thomas, I don't think anyone would call that a great offensive line.
It was not.
And to your larger point, Georgia's offensive line, I don't expect it to be, from a talent perspective, as good as it was a year ago. It just needs to not be a liability.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the most important thing when it comes to the offensive line. And you know, Sam Pittman is a great offensive line coach, one of the best in the country. Replacing him will not be easy, but you know, if there's a guy that's up to the task of doing it, short of it being Mario Cristobal at Oregon, who was a way overqualified offensive line coach for Alabama for a long time, it'd be Matt Luke. And there's a lot of talent, as you just laid out, and they bring in a couple of pretty talented players, specifically Broderick Jones, who, from all indications, looks like a future first-round NFL offensive tackle. Now, he did have the injury, as Jeff Sentell reported earlier this week, but that's not expected to be a significant long-term injury. So, you know, if you're playing Broderick Jones there at right tackle, or if it's Xavier Truss or Warren McClendon, as long as the offensive line is just good enough, as long as it's not a liability, as long as it's not actively hurting you, I think Georgia can still be fine.
You mentioned Broderick Jones. You're a lot younger than me. I said on the show this week, I am not scandalized by whatever kind of bike accident it was. I guess there's some doubt about that. Let's say it was one of the motorbike type things that I guess Jones is kind of famous for liking. If that was true, I wouldn't be mad at him.
Yeah, and it goes back, you know, we've said it about Jake Fromm before. You know, it was a little different with Jake because for some reason he just kept finding ways to get hurt out on the water.
I said that during that offseason ahead of the 2018 season that his summer had been a combination of Field and Stream and WebMD. It's like he found a way to get hurt in every kind of outdoors activity he could have.
Yeah, so, you know, people, I don't think my generation anyway is going to be mad at guys for going out and living their life the way they want to, until I think it becomes, you know, a chronic. Like if this happens 3-4 times, then maybe you worry about it a little bit more, or a lot bit more, depending on how good he is.
Right.
But, you know, a one-time isolated incident, you know.
Yeah, I don't want you street racing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want you drifting.
I don't want you turning into Dominic Toretto, but.
Right.
But, you know, Sony Michel had I believe, an ATV injury before, what was it, 2017 or 2015 season? One of those.
He was going into the 2016 season. I don't think he played in the Virginia game, maybe. Not Virginia, North Carolina. Either way, you know, no one was really mad or that upset with Sony Michel, at least to my knowledge about it. It's just, you know, sometimes you're out doing stuff in life and you get hurt. Very last quick final thing. Jeff, I have great respect for him as a reporter. Obviously, the sources coast to Broderick Jones. I have great respect for them there as well. I am going to double that prognosis, though. If they're saying, it's 2 to 4 weeks, in my mind, I'm probably just going to multiply that by 2 because folks close to a guy like that are going to be, I would say, just natural tendency to be optimistic about the prognosis. So if they're saying 2 to 4, I might say 4 to 6, just out of just because of human nature.
I absolutely believe this is like a 4-week injury and not necessarily a 2-week injury.
Which I do think slows. And listen, I say this with great respect because my gosh, this guy looks like everything you'd want an offensive lineman to look like. But if it's 4-ish weeks of injury rehab, I do think that slows down his progression during the season.
Yeah,
I do.
I mean, you look last year at Nakobe Dean, all indications were he was going to play a very prominent role in the Georgia defense to start the season. He suffers an ankle injury in the middle of August, and you know that's a 3-4 week injury, and he really doesn't start looking like the player he did in the second half of the season until about week 6 or 7. So, you know, those camp reps, I think, especially when you're a young player, are vitally important. And you know, if Jones misses a lot of that, it's probably going to mean he's not starting Georgia's first game of the season, assuming that's still early September.
And I believe he would have been my pick to start otherwise. Maybe not week 1, whatever week 1 even is. Maybe week 1's not. I won't say.
Yeah.
But, I mean, in normal circumstances, I would have said that Broderick Jones spends the majority of the season as the starter at right tackle. Now I'm not quite so sure, although I'm not necessarily one to sell stock on that idea either.
Yeah, you're certainly. I think if you had position in the stock of Xavier Truss or Warren McClendon, you're feeling a good bit better today than you were perhaps 2 weeks ago.
And by the way, when we had, we'll wrap up into this, but when we've had John Stinchcomb on the show, John has talked up with Xavier Truss, talked up Warren McClendon. John's a big believer that even though we saw Andrew Thomas do this in 2017, don't take an anecdote as, confuse that with data, that this is still a position where experience matters, and by being in the, I mean experience in the program, having been here for a while. So John, who knows the position well, was an All-American at Georgia at the tackle spot, says that he would have probably cast his lot with experience anyway.
Yeah, I wrote the story back in February after Kirby Smart made the remarks that you don't usually the history of freshmen coming in and playing one of the starting tackle spots is not good. I believe since Kirby Smart has taken over, and I'll have to double check this, Andrew Thomas is the only SEC offensive lineman to start every game at tackle as a freshman.
Yeah, like Leatherwood playing by the end of the year, but not really the beginning of the year.
Right.
Trey Smith probably in 2016.
But I
maybe.
believe that was a guard.
Okay, you may be right about that.
So,
yeah. So I think that's a pretty good point. All right, good stuff, Connor. Thanks for everything. We'll look forward to reading you, by the way, at DawgNation.com.
Yep, as always, and have a great vacation, BA.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Connor says have a great vacation because this is the last time that he'll talk to me on air, but we're still live the rest of the day today and tomorrow. I'm a big believer in this. I like to finish strong. I don't like to mail it in going in towards a vacation. You want to feel like you've earned the vacation when you get there. So we've got big shows ahead the next couple of days, and as I said before, we're going to have pre-recorded shows each and every day next week. This is kind of a new thing for us. We've had pre-recorded podcasts for a while because, let's face it, all podcasts to a degree are pre-recorded. This will be the first time, though, that we've kind of done pre-recorded video shows for a full week. They're not going to be quite as long. We are taking a break from radio next week because we're not doing the full hour next week. But we are going to preview the season. That's why I'm wearing my Own the East t-shirt right now. You may see a lot of this over the next few days. I'm going to be in kind of Own the East mode here, both looking at Georgia. John Stinchcomb is going to help us out with that. Jeff Sintel will be with us both tomorrow and the following Friday as per usual. So we're going to kind of cover a lot of ground on that front. With that in mind, let me talk about Florida here for a moment because obviously, and what we're going to do is we're going to do Florida today. We'll do Tennessee in the spot tomorrow. Kind of head towards next week with South Carolina. Eventually get to some of the SEC West teams there as well just for the fun. And the one thing I don't need, although I welcome all your feedback, I don't need you to say, well, BA, none of this is going to matter if the season doesn't take place. I'm fully aware of that. I'm right there on the same page with you, that there's a very good chance the preview stuff ends up feeling a little bit irrelevant if, the naysayers get their way. But for the most part, we're going to operate right now as if the season is going to take place, and we'll just chalk this up to a fun conversation. If it ends up being that we're twiddling our thumbs and staring at the wall come October, we're just going to deal with that then. For now, we're going to pretend that the season's taking place. And when I talk about Florida here for a moment, the first team that we're previewing from the SEC East as part of our Own the East season preview, here's what I'm going to say. When you guys hear me talk about Florida, typically I'm usually finding some way to mock them, usually finding some way to push back on the stuff that's been said about them. I feel like, even though, fair and balance is not necessarily the goal that we're striking for here on this show, I feel like I've done a pretty good job of explaining with some evidence as to why some of the hot take stuff surrounding Florida this season doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. One thing we've said before is it almost seems like it's an outcome looking for evidence as opposed to evidence that builds to an outcome. But I want to do a different tact on this for right now. I want to talk a little bit about what is interesting about Florida and one of the things that Gators fans would probably say if they were here right now. And let's start with the quarterback position here for a moment. We talk a lot about Kyle Trask. It's fair to say that there are outlets like Pro Football Focus that don't seem to like Trask as much as some of the outlets out there do. There's also been some chatter out there about, well, maybe it's really Emory Jones that'll be playing more for Florida. One way or another, Dan Mullen does fashion himself as a smart coach. You would think this season they are going to attempt to get Emory Jones involved somehow, even if it's just as a package player. More than just a small taste of Emory Jones. That would seem to make some sense because one of the things we'll get into in a moment is that for Kyle Trask, who's trying to have a big year this year, he's going to do it this year with a lot fewer proven options at the receiver spot than what he had a year ago. Kirby Smart told you this before the game last season, and I would have even admitted this as kind of a chief Gator hater, someone that openly brags about how much I hate Florida. I would have acknowledged a year ago, wow, that Florida wide receiver core really pretty good. They utilized the transfer market very well. Guys like Van Jefferson, they had some players who could play in that receiver spot. It's not quite as proven there this year. So what some of the conventional wisdom is, that actually may hurt Trask's development. Even if we'll stipulate for a moment that those people that seem to love Trask are right about that, there's a chance that he just doesn't have as many targets to throw to. We saw that hurt Jake Fromm a year ago at Georgia. So that may open the door for Emory Jones. One of the things that Florida fans will also tell you is they bring back starters, they bring back experience along the offensive line. Now, the mocking comment I want to make in response to that would be, this wasn't an offensive line that was very good a year ago. Bringing back those starters is not necessarily a guarantee it gets better. You don't get better just because you get older. Sometimes experience causes you to improve, but if you're not a good player, and Florida has not recruited along the offensive line, I mean, the recruitment of Martez Ivey is a long time ago now. You know, going out there and getting the elite offensive line prospect, hadn't been a lot of that going on for Florida as of late, but it is experience along the offensive line. Gators fans would say more experience than what Georgia brings to the table. And it sets up, I think, in a very interesting scenario involving the Florida running backs here for a moment. You know, Dameon Pierce is a guy that many of you know. At one point in time would have been a player on the radar for Georgia just a bit at the running back position. He's from Kirby Smart's hometown of Bainbridge, and Florida did get some good transfer news. That's almost always a theme for the Gators. Got some good transfer news to the tune of Lorenzo Lingard, former five-star coming out of high school, not used very much at Miami, also dealt with an injury. Dameon Pierce, Lorenzo Lingard, do they team up to give Florida a capable running game? There's a huge storyline for why Florida lost against Georgia last year in November, because the Gators could not run the ball. Dan Mullen said they weren't even trying to run the ball because they didn't really have effective running backs. Pierce, Lingard running behind a experienced offensive line. How much does that change what Florida looks like? Kirby Smart has told us before that the best version of the Dan Mullen offense includes what Smart has called downhill runners. Does Florida have that this year with Pierce and Lingard? If they do, then some of the people who've said this is a threat to Georgia, that's a way in which that could be proven to be true. However, if Pierce plays a little bit more closely associated with his high school profile, if Lingard plays a little bit more like the guy that Miami just didn't really choose to use very much, then that's obviously a problem. I mentioned the receiver spot. This is a put up or shut up year, I think, for Jacob Copeland. That's a guy that on the recruiting trail got talked about a lot, and he gets a chance to really flourish at Florida this year, being thrown to by Kyle Trask. Copeland's going to be one of those swing players in the Florida offense that tells you which way this is going to go. And speaking of transfers, still awaiting the news on Justin Shorter, another former five-star. He was at Penn State. He has not gotten his news from the NCAA yet, but the presence of Shorter, even though Shorter hasn't done much for the Nittany Lions, could change things just a bit. Defensively, we've told you before that over the last 3 years, the Todd Grantham defense has been better than the Dan Mullen offense. Doesn't get treated that way by the media, but relative to expectations for where they were coaching at Florida the last couple of years, Mississippi State before that, I think that Grantham's absolutely outperformed Dan Mullen. Of course, he's going to apparently get some help here, too. Paul Pasqualoni, you may know him as the former Syracuse coach, has been hired as a special assistant. I don't know if this is like the thing from The Office, the assistant to the general manager, if that's what a Paul Pasqualoni is going to be for Dan Mullen right now, but he is here. And then the last thing to know about Florida is that this will once again be a good secondary. So if you don't hear the Gator haters say anything nice about Florida other than this, Kyrie Lam, a recruiting battle that Georgia lost, Elam's turned out to be a pretty good player. Marco Wilson's still there. You already know that he's a good player. They had a safety named Sean Davis as well, who's probably worth paying attention to also. Florida typically has had a good secondary. This will be a good secondary. Big questions in the front seven, I would say, defensively. Zachary Carter may be a guy trying to be an impact player. But for the most part, expect Florida to be good defensively. Expect the secondary to once again lead the way there, and we'll make that your SEC through. And we'll do a version of that kind of every single day over the course of the next week or so, looking at the On the East season preview. A lot of this will be related to Georgia, mostly at the beginning of the show starting next week, but also a little deeper look at some of the teams that Georgia will be playing in its division. The rest of the SEC West will kind of culminate with our own predictions for all of this. We'll do a lot of that next week as a part of a vacation issue editions of DawgNation Daily here, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. I got a couple things I want to do before we wrap up today's version of our program. Let me move on to the world of recruiting here for a moment. Amarius Mims, the five-star offensive lineman, is getting slated for a decision coming up in August. Who is he considering? Well, he was good enough to tell us that yesterday on social media. I can show you this here. of the announcement for Marius Mims. He's got finalists. Georgia is a part of that group for Mims, and this is obviously a guy that Georgia fans, I think, continue to feel really good about. You see the top 6 for him there. And by the way, this is kind of a, for those of you watching a video, this is a fairly consistent graphic template. I feel like we've seen a few recruits where they've had their picture in the middle, they've had the logos down the bottom with the mascots kind of in the background there. I feel like that's become a little bit of a template here. But it's Alabama, Auburn, Florida State, Tennessee, Georgia, and Oklahoma in on Marius Mims here. Of course, this you can't help talk about Mims, but also talking about Terrence Ferguson, who's slated to make his announcement this weekend. Jeff Sintel had some stuff for you last night on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger about that. I think there's some growing chatter, and we'll talk with Jeff in person about this on our show tomorrow. But I think there's some growing chatter that just maybe things aren't going well with UGA and Ferguson at the moment, based on kind of what the internet seems to be saying at the moment. But no sense of slowing things down with Marius Mims. And I guess the decision you're left to decide is, given the fact that Georgia's already won big with Micah Morris, already won big with Dylan Fairchild, would seem to be still in very much good shape with Marius Mims. How realistic was it that Georgia would bring in all 4 of those highly coveted offensive linemen? I guess that's something that'll be debated here, but it seems like right now Georgia may be in a better position with Marius Mims, more so than Terrence Ferguson, on the basis of what Jeff Sintel said last night on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. We'll talk to Jeff about that when he joins us tomorrow. Speaking of high school recruits, by the way, for a moment before we get ready to say goodbye on today's show, I thought there was an interesting nugget in that Sports Illustrated piece that we quoted from off the very beginning today about how there was a Louisiana football coach that said if the SEC comes back, it's going to be easier for high school football to also return there as well. And this doesn't really probably matter very much, but I was kind of thinking the exact opposite might be true. Think about when you watch NFL games on Sundays now. What do the offenses look like? They look a lot like what college football looked like a few years ago. And those college offenses look a lot like what the high school teams were doing a few years before that. Think about guys like Chad Morris and Gus Malzahn and Art Briles, who were great high school coaches, ushered in the spread offense, and it trickled its way up through the other ranks of football. College football is not really a trickle-down sport. It's more of a trickle-up sport. I would suggest the more that high schools around the various SEC country, the more they announce their plans to return, I think that may help college more than you might think. Gatorade Updater, 1,356 days. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. And boy, huge thanks to Connor Riley. I try not to talk about this too much during the show because I want to, keep people's attention where it's supposed to be. We've got so many bells and whistles sometimes in the studio that one little thing going out, it's almost like whack-a-mole game. You're over here whacking this, and you got some other issue pop up over there. We had quite a very small technical thing this morning that turned into potentially a very big thing. Were we on the air, Connor? I don't even know. Were we on the air on platforms and things like that? All right, so yeah, so apparently we sailed right on through and kept it on the air, but for a good moment, that was not a given. I always jokingly say that we, not me, but the folks that do all this, we make this look a lot easier than it actually is, being on as many platforms as we are every single day. So big thanks to the people who make that possible. And a huge thanks to R.S. Andrews for making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do all of that for you. Air conditionings, let's face it, summer weather is here. It's hotter than it's been. For a while in June, it seems like you could kind of be outside and not just be too crazy, but boy, it's on schedule, as scheduled. It is really heating up. So if you're worried about your air conditioning unit, get your system tuned back up to factory fresh specs. You can find them online at rsandrews.com. I've got some comments I've got to get ready to go here. And we will start rolling through a lot of these with you. Let me pop over here and we'll get some and get rolling. Let me go to YouTube first, because the YouTube people said I was on Facebook too long yesterday. So I'll start on YouTube, and we'll take some of your comments there, and I'll try to do a better job of toggling back and forth. I think yesterday I spent a little too long on one side. Noah Sheldon says Todd Grantham doesn't scare me. I think that's probably fine. I think it's probably true. I think you're right to say that as a Georgia fan. I wonder how much of the conversation, because if you go back and look at Georgia's win against Florida a year ago, and I would have said this during the regular show if I had more time. If you go back and look at Georgia's performance last year, for the most part, Georgia did not do much offensively on first or second down. The idea of third and Grantham being a real thing. Last year's game is pretty indicative of that Georgia did most of its feasting offensively on third down. The passing numbers, for instance, on first and second down were not good last year. Georgia really went for home runs on third down, and they got that. If you're a Florida fan, and I'm not saying this is why Pasqualoni was brought in, but if you want to speculate about what an extra pair of eyes could potentially do, help Florida and Grantham in particular figure out what went wrong on those third down plays a year ago. And there was a lot of third down issues for Florida against Georgia in 2018 too. So it would seem weird if Florida wasn't doing some, I think they call it red teaming, when you're trying to identify your own weaknesses. It'd be weird if Florida wasn't trying to do some red team drills right now on why it's failed so spectacularly on third down the last couple of years against Georgia for reasons other than it just being third and Grant. G. Grace, Bama Boy, trying to put some negativity into the atmosphere. Come on, Bama Boy. Come on. So Dante E. says experience is definitely a benefit, but it's not a deciding factor. He says it's going to be Newman as quarterback 1, Dwayne Mathis as QB 2. All right, we'll see how that plays out. Rodney Hewitt says if Ferguson goes to Bama, he thinks that could be good news for Marius Mims. Maybe once he heard Mims was going to UGA with the class already having plenty of offensive line talent, he just thought he'd be better off. I think it is probably fair to say that for someone like Terrence Ferguson, you're going to be aware of how much talent has been added to the Georgia roster the last couple of years. It's kind of funny to think how much things have changed, that all of a sudden Alabama is negative recruiting against Georgia for how deep its offensive line situation is. It may be true that Georgia views Ferguson more as a guard. I'm just speculating here. That could be true. That's not thought to be the premium position that tackle is. I wouldn't put it past Alabama to sell him on the idea of playing the premium position on their roster. Sometimes that's what teams do, and I guess all is fair in love and recruiting. But I would say that the overall level of depth in place at a place like Georgia factors into that. Stephen Venanzi says at Towson we had a transfer for quarterback from Wisconsin. He never played the next year when Vad Lee, I remember him, was looking to transfer to our program. He went to James Madison instead. So, yeah, you see some examples of that. That's an interesting comparison, Stephen. Dapper Dan says, what kind of tailgating restrictions do you predict there'll be this season? I think extreme tailgate restrictions. I think it's going to be a very, very serious, and I hate to be that way, but the one thing that I think that we see less of, I talked to you at the beginning of the show about the presence of some fans last night at NASCAR. I have, for the most part, put the notion of how many fans will be in the stands on the back burner for right now. At the very beginning of the season, at least, assuming we have a season, I think fan attendance will be very limited, very limited. And I think that until the stadium capacity raises more, I just think they're going to do everything they can to limit that tailgating. Because remember, for the most part, it's fairly easy for these institutions to limit tailgating because most of the tailgating takes place on campus. Remember, just to get into the weeds here for a moment, if you're not tailgating on campus in Athens, I think you're technically subject to open container laws, aren't you? So, I mean, most people on the Athens campus technically like to tailgate on campus. And so, since that's your property, the on-campus property, you can pretty clearly, have pretty strong say in who uses that. So, if Georgia's playing a game and there are 13,000 fans allowed in the stadium, I think you're going to see what essentially amounts to a full shutdown on tailgating. And I say that as someone who loves the tailgating experience, but I am not optimistic about tailgating right now, even if I am still pretty optimistic about the games themselves being played. I always like our buddy Huck Finn, who's, professional troll. I always love that he comes now with like double barrel troll action. On the one hand, he's trolling you to say the season's not going to take place. On the other hand, he's saying if the season does take place, Florida will win the national championship. Let's see what's over here on Facebook here for a moment. And I'll come back to YouTube. I promise I won't stay. It's also gotten a little bit. All right, over here on Facebook for a moment as part of our S. Andrews cool down. And always take the Facebook comment a little while to load up here. But over here on the Facebook side of things, Shelton Tucker says it's too much money to go to a game anymore. Find a place to park. It's like $3,000. I would say that, the game experience for college football has always been a pretty significant investment, at least the last several years it has been. Both in terms of money and time, right? It's like if I called you and said, hey, guess what? I got some Braves tickets tonight. We get to set at 5:30 to go to a game that starts at 7, assuming you live in the Atlanta area, and it's just not a very it's not a very significant investment of necessarily time. You can easily get there, money, a wide-ranging option for a number of tickets. College football is different. For the most part, college football tickets are expensive, especially for the people who are kind of forced to find those in the secondary market. But even with the people who are investing in the university, be a donor, things like that, that's a lot of extra money. To go to see Georgia play Louisiana Monroe, you're paying about $100 per ticket just to go to that game. It's a pretty expensive proposition all the way around. And when you start factoring in parking and what it takes to put a tailgate together each and every week, it's not an insignificant financial choice. I mean, I think a lot of the people who are big into Georgia football and like the travel and like going to the games, I think they would say that they don't have necessarily 1,000 hobbies, right? I mean, maybe they play golf when it's not football season, but for the most part, it's not like, I'm college football this week, but I'm skiing in Antwerp. Is there skiing in Antwerp? I don't know. I'm skiing in, Steamboat Springs the following week. If you're going to make Georgia football your hobby, unless you're just, one of the Rockefellers, if you're going to make Georgia football your hobby, it's not like you're going to have 1,000 other hobbies. So, yeah, I think that's probably true. Matt Rukavina says he's got a repeat post. I guess I didn't see it. I'm sorry. Hayes Callaway mentioning the Tiger Woods back here. Absolutely. The memorial this week there in Muirfield Village in Ohio. Typically speaking, one of the bigger PGA Tour events. The PGA Tour is always kind of weird because, like, you think about the summer being kind of golf season, but for the most part, the PGA Tour, other than the typical majors, kind of takes a little bit of a dip during the summer. It's really the winter when the PGA Tour is at its best. California Swing, Phoenix Open, even some of the stuff in Hawaii. Then you get to Florida prior to the Masters. That's typically the best version of the PGA Tour season. Summer, typically a little bit of a dip, but kind of nice to have the memorial here going on this weekend. Huge field. It does include Tiger Woods, but also some pretty other impressive golfers there as well. John Benton says, what's the money situation for the UGA Virginia opener? Would we lose money? As it stands right now, there's a contract slated to pay Georgia $4 million. Now, this is one of those things where the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl folks will say, we ain't got the money because we don't have fans in the stands. Because the one thing I didn't know this. Tim Tucker wrote about this for the AJC. I thought it was actually pretty fascinating. That I would have assumed that somehow, as the folks that put the game together, that somehow the TV money might be siphoned over to the Peach Bowl, at least somewhat. I think that's the way the bowls work. Don't the bowls get some TV money? I would have thought that would be the way. But the way the AJC reported this is that the TV money was paid to the conferences. So we have an SEC and ACC team. They have the money paid to them as the arrangement. The way that the Peach Bowl makes money off that is by selling the tickets, by selling the sponsorships, not the commercials that run during the game, but the sponsorships that are activated around the stadium. I can say this, that our company was definitely going to be a part of that. We had talked about some big dollars to be invested for a huge tailgating presence right there next to the stadium. Those conversations have been ongoing for more than a year. We were ready to pull the trigger on that. Obviously, there's a reason now that we're not, but that's really the way the Peach Bowl makes their money. So as long as you've got a team like Georgia there, you can pay them $4 million because you're going to make that money back plus more on the tickets you sell, the sponsorships that you build in and around the stadium. Well, it's hard to have these sort of in-stadium sponsors if there are no fans to see the ads. It's hard to have the activation outside if there's no one walking around outside. And all of a sudden now, the money that the Peach Bowl owes Georgia based on the terms of this contract, there's a very good chance they just don't have any way of paying that money. That's one of the reason when that game may fizzle. Georgia's not going to voluntarily give up its right to that money, but it just could be that contract fizzles because of that. Hayes Galloway says he has no doubt they'll beat Alabama twice. Boy, can't wait to see that. Robert Barnes brings up a good point. When I was younger, this didn't really bother me that bad, but it is kind of funny how much, long day of tailgating in some of these really hot early season games. It is hot, man. It is hot. When I was younger, somehow I just sort of shook it off. But man, it is hot. Christopher White says he's had some college game day VIP experience. That's probably pretty fun. PJ Weiss, funny stuff. Let me go back over to YouTube here for a moment. We got a couple of minutes left. We're going to get ready to wrap up. Let's see what else is going on. Pro King 123 says, I like the guys we got right now with, so talking about, guys like Jefferson and Dean, some of the 2021 defensive line guys. Also mentioning, Corey Foreman, Mason Smith, Tyron Ingram Dawkins. I guess Ingram Dawkins certainly seems like he could be very well, moving towards UGA. I would say that Georgia's in the mix for Foreman and, probably a wait-and-see approach on Mason Smith. But the point that you make is probably a good one, that, Jefferson's the kind of player that Georgia would want any cycle. And I would say that Marlon Dean's got a lot of that you like about him there as well. And if Georgia does get Tyron Ingram Dawkins, then, that's a guy who, seems to be blossoming at the right time in terms of the overall projection of him as a player. Jay Shipes brings up a really good point that hopefully the COVID climate will be trending the right direction when I come back. Yeah, so we're still live tomorrow, but it's a week's worth of hoping we have a little bit better news cycle the following Monday. I think that's a pretty good thing to wish for. Mark Abe says, news just dropped about the NCAA and Power 5 putting in medical regulations. Hope that means a season. I'll have to take a look at that and see what that says. Nature Gator says, will Georgia play Georgia Tech if SEC teams play one non-conference game? Florida has stated they will have to play Florida State regardless. Yeah, it's a state law that Florida and Florida State have to play each other, I believe. Now, it's easy to probably skirt that. There are lots of state laws that don't get enforced, but I believe that's a state law in the Sunshine State. If you could get a +1 model, Georgia and Georgia Tech would definitely play each other. And this is more about just the ease of playing the game. The fact that it's not a game in which you have to pay an opponent to be there. Tech doesn't get $1 million for coming to Sanford Stadium, even though at the time it doesn't perform better than some of the teams that do get 7-figure sums for showing up. But it doesn't get that money for doing that because you go to their stadium every other year. It's essentially a barter agreement. So in addition to the fact that it's a rivalry worth preserving, it's also an easy game to play. And it'd be better to have more games on the schedule if you can have them easily. It's one of the same reasons, like as you said, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina, Kentucky, Louisville. It's actually a very interesting coincidence that so many SEC teams play so many ACC teams each and every year. And as luck would have it, Auburn's playing North Carolina. Arkansas's playing Notre Dame. I think Mississippi State's playing BYU. Tennessee's playing Oklahoma. Missouri's playing blah, blah, blah. Just about everybody's got somebody that you could, conceivably play and make it a fairly fair 9-game schedule. I think that the problem that you run into with, if you try to get into the 10-game schedule, which would obviously be better for us, we want more college football, not less, but all of a sudden you're going to run the risk of making people mad that you have contractual agreements with. Louisiana Monroe, for instance, East Tennessee State, teams like that Georgia's supposed to be playing, they're going to start saying, we want our money. You're playing games, you're not playing us. We don't want our money for that. All right. Let's see anything else here before we get. All right, let me see if there's anything else before we get ready to wrap up here today. Keith Fold says, if we play Tech, I hope I get to be there. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we've speculated more out of fun than anything else is the possibility that the schedule, or at least in terms of the fans allowed, increases over the course of the schedule. If things go well, you could see that potentially happening. You saw some of that with Major League Baseball, where there were no fans. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, maybe we will, consider having some fans in the stands. So, from that standpoint, right now Major League Baseball I don't think is doing that, but they at least became more open to that possibility. Maybe you could see a scenario where if things go well, all of a sudden college football is opened up to more people as the season goes along. So very few fans early in the year, but as you get towards later in the year, maybe more fans kind of showing up. Could be worth considering there, and something kind of interesting all the way around on that. We're going to get ready to wrap up for today. Thanks for being a part of the show. Of course, huge thanks to the AJC for keeping us up to date with really everything going on in our world here. You can get your Atlanta news now at AJC.com. The latest on the mask situation, goodness knows I ain't talking about that on the show, but if you want to know where things stand right now, AJC.com for a lot more on that. Also, public fishing areas, one of the great ways to be socially distant right now, be outside, enjoy some time. Fishing a good option when that comes around. AJC.com for more on that. And just a whole lot of fun stuff going on. Atlanta United is actually playing right now. This is live, right? This Atlanta United match is live right now. So we technically have some Atlanta sports taking place at the moment. It looks like they're losing to what I'm assuming is Cincinnati. Actually, it's over. So Atlanta United loses here. A game that had to start, like 9 a.m. local time, something like that. So United has dropped a result on the pitch. But nonetheless, you can read about the game if you want to. AJC.com for your Atlanta news now. By the way, R.S. Andrews, they make the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. You can find them online at rsandrews.com. We appreciate you being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Live show for us tomorrow, back here at 10 a.m. We'll see you for that. Our Own the East season preview will continue, and a lot more fun as well. We'll talk to you then, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.